Welcome tonight. It's great to see a full room of people with bodies instead of just faces on Zoom. We're thrilled that you're here. Yay, yay. And welcome also to those that are watching online or will be watching later. But my name is Claire Seckler-Merkel, and I'm the president of the board of the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations, along with being the senior director for the McCain Institute here in Arizona. And we are thrilled that you are all here tonight. As many of you have noticed, in the past few years, the focus on the role of local, state, and federal courts has intensified and at times been very controversial. We look forward to hearing from our very distinguished panel this evening and moderators as we ask whether independent judiciaries can serve as bulwarks for democracy. We at PCFR are grateful for our partnership with the ASU Center for Constitutional Design at ASU Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law for working with us to make this program happen. Their support allows us to broaden our reach and bring the best in foreign policy discussions right here to Arizona. Tonight's program is an excellent example of PCFR's mission in action to provide forums that explore critical foreign policy issues and build enduring international connections. And we welcome all of our PCFR members especially. For those of you who are not yet a PCFR member, we welcome you to join our community of very interesting and interested people in foreign affairs. If you are interested in joining, you can check out our website at pcfraz.org or speak to any one of us here tonight. We'd be happy to talk with you. A couple of quick programming notes for upcoming PCFR programs. On November 16th, after this fabulous panel tonight, we're going to have another in-person discussion with John Erath from the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation in Washington, discussing the new age of arms control and how to navigate nuclear threats, a somewhat timely topic. And on November 17th, we'll host a members-only reception and program with the mayor and chief executive of Antrim and Newton Abbey, Northern Ireland, as they discuss the benefits of reaching out to global partners such as Gilbert, Arizona, on issues of international diplomacy, trade, and economic development. So please sign up for these and other events on the website. And before we get started, I must thank our corporate sponsors for making our work possible. Our premier ambassador sponsor, South 32, our envoy corporate members, Chicanos por la Causa and Freeport-McMoran, and our diplomat and champion corporate members. I would also like to thank our international visionary donor, Ellen Schultz, who's amazing, and our lifetime benefactors whose generous gifts allow PCFR to keep doing what we do and fulfill our mission. Keith Galbett, Charles Zirian, Karen Meyer, JP Mion, Shoshana Tanser, and Melissa Sanderson. So without further ado, it is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Stephanie Lindquist. And she's also a PCFR member and good friend. She's a professor of law and political sciences in the School of Global Politics and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law here at ASU. She is a renowned expert on the U.S. Supreme Court, constitutional law, and administrative law. She has co-authored 3 books and dozens of published articles and chapters. She earned her JD from Temple University and her PhD in political science at the University of South Carolina. So pleased to welcome my ASU colleague, Dr. Stephanie Lindquist, to moderate tonight's panel.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Well, many thanks to Claire and many thanks to PCFR for the opportunity to partner with that incredible organization for this event this evening. I want to thank Claire, and I want to thank Tina Waddington and Sam Richardson, who are here helping with the event, helped us plan the event. So thanks to your wonderful organization for this opportunity this evening. As Claire said, my name is Stephanie Lindquist. I'm the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Design here at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. We are a new center founded in late 2021 through the generous support of the Lodestar Foundation and our very own Jerry Hirsch, and thank you to Jerry for his generosity. The center's purpose is to explore and develop new ideas about constitutional design to sustain our constitutional democracy for generations to come. And it's through partnerships with organizations like PCFR, like the National Constitution Center, that we seek to understand not only the U.S. constitutional system, but other constitutional systems, to mine those systems for ideas about how we can improve our own. And we hope to promote reforms that might make our system and other constitutional regimes around the world, democracies around the world, more effective and efficient at advancing democratic representation. So today we are here to discuss the role of courts in democracy. That's what I study, so very excited to be here. And especially we're asking the question whether courts can serve as bulwarks of democracy in the face of authoritarian and anti-democratic forces within a democratic regime. And we are really pleased, extremely pleased to have with us, either in person or remotely, 3 internationally renowned scholars of democracy who study threats to democracy and what we can do about them. So we're going to begin our conversation with the gentleman to our right. We have 2 who are here remote, and then, of course, Jeff's here in person. Jeff Staton, a longtime friend of mine, so pleased to have him here. He's professor of political science at Emory University. He directs their Center for Law and Politics. He has published numerous works on judicial independence and on judicial legitimacy, and he is the project manager, one of the project managers of the Varieties of Democracy project, which produces one of the most widely deployed databases out there on dimensions of democracy around the world. And Jeff manages the judiciary part of that particular very well-known project. And his most recent book was published in 2022 by Cambridge University Press, and it's entitled, Can Courts Be Bulwarks of Democracy? So I guess you may have figured out by now where I got the idea, where we got the idea for this panel. You really did provide the impetus to the panel. I saw Jeff in Mexico about 2 months ago or 3 months ago, and had the maybe 4 months, had the conversation about it then. So pleased he is here. We are also incredibly pleased to be joined by Professor Larry Diamond. He is on screen. You can see him at the back of the room. We can see him on a screen here in front of us. So when we do talk to the individuals on the video or on Zoom, we'll be looking this way, but you might be looking that way. So please don't let that distract you. I think Larry probably needs no introduction to most of you in this group. One might say he wrote the book on democracy. He serves as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and as the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at the Freeman Spogli, or I'm sure I'm pronouncing Spogli, okay, Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. He was the founding editor of the Journal of Democracy and has a list of accomplishments and publications far too long to repeat here. His most recent book is Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency, published in 2019. And I just have to put a plug in for his most recent article in Foreign Affairs entitled All Democracy is Global. It's really a must-read for those of us concerned about erosions in America's role as in promoting democracy worldwide. It's a wonderful article. And finally, from Australia, we are joined by Professor Tom Daly. He serves as the Deputy Director of the Melbourne School of Government at the University of Melbourne. It is tomorrow for him. Thanks to Tom for being here at a different time zone. He serves as the director of the global online research platform called Democratic Decay and Renewal, and he's co-convener of the Constitution Transformation Network in Melbourne. Not only has Tom written widely on democratization and threats to democratic rule, but he has worked on the ground as a consultant to multiple governments and to multiple international organizations such as the EU, the Council of Europe, African Union, International IDEA, on issues related to human rights and democracy building. Tom, thanks for joining us from Australia. And Larry, thanks to you for joining us as well. This event will proceed as follows. So first, Jeff is going to kick us off with his conclusions about our animating question, whether courts can serve as bulwarks of democracy. And then I'm going to turn the floor to Professors Diamond and Daly, and I will serve to make their remarks, and I will serve as moderator of a conversation between the 3 of these gentlemen. However, I'm hoping no later than 6:45 or 6:50, We can turn the floor over to questions from the audience because I've been to PCFR events. I know how active the audience is. What you'll see above your heads are green discs. Those are actually microphones. So we actually don't have to have you move to a microphone to ask your question, but if you have a question, if you'd be so kind, if you'll raise your hand, I'll recognize you, and if you could stand up and you can ask the question to the group. And we'll all hear you, and I'll then repeat it to be sure that our visitors on Zoom, our guests on Zoom, have heard the question as well. So I will now turn it over to Professor Staton.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and it's nice to see everyone. I am going to answer your question straight off the bat and then tell you a little bit about the book. The answer that we provide in the book is, well, certainly there are a number of conditions under which you ought not to expect independent courts to do much about saving democracies. And insofar as they do, and we think they can, they don't do it by doing some of the most familiar things you might notice about courts, which is they don't do it primarily, at least on our account, by actively stopping governments from taking actions that they shouldn't be taking. They might do that. But the mechanism that we're really thinking about is a mechanism in which they incentivize leaders of countries to be more prudent in the policy decisions that they make, which raise fewer questions about whether they're overstepping the bounds of their authority. And they simultaneously incentivize opposition party leaders to accept actions of governments that might look like they're crossing boundaries when they might otherwise, there might be a reasonable reason for them doing so. So it's really through the incentivization of prudence on the part of leaders and opposition that we think independent courts have this effect. So that's basically the story of the book. What I want to do is give you a little bit of motivation for it. I suppose, and tell you why we think it's a controversial question to ask, and then tell you a little bit about the argument. I want to give you just a couple pieces of empirical evidence without showing you any figures. You bring a political scientist to a group, we want to tell you some facts about things. But I won't spend too much time on that. The question whether courts can be bulwarks of democracy we think is controversial for a couple reasons. One is the obvious reason is that there are many instances in the history of the world in which it would appear that the judiciary of the regime was part and parcel of the breakdown of a democracy. So whether we're talking about the Weimar Republic or we're talking about early 1970s Chile, it's not clear at all that those judiciaries were serving as defenders of democracy, but rather part of a regime, part of an anti-regime move. Okay, so that's the first thing. So the answer is never going to be yes or no, right? The question is going to be under what conditions can they be so. The second reason we think it's a bit controversial actually comes out of our field. So independent courts, by which we mean courts, I mean this behaviorally, courts that have judges on it whose decisions are not merely the reflection of, say, the sitting government's preferences over policy. That's what we mean. Okay? That those kinds of judges in the courts on which they sit are products of democracy. That is, they are produced under conditions of democratic competition. The standard reason is that when I agree to enter a lottery via an election over future power, and I understand I might be out of power in the future, we have incentives to create institutions that protect each other when we don't hold power, right? So that's now why this makes this question controversial is if these are products of democratization and democracy, how is it that they would actually be defending it, right? So that's the second thing. The third is there's just a really large literature that thinks democracies survive based on macroeconomic conditions, wealth of the country, the inequality of the country, or socio-cultural reasons, like the sort of types of people that live in the state. And what the court system would do is not entirely clear. And then finally, there's a lot of evidence that judges, when they try to hold politicians accountable for their behavior, are attacked, sometimes ignored, courts are packed, courts are stripped. And so if you have a court system that's under this, where judges are under this kind of pressure, how can you expect them to be serving as protectors of democracy? So that's sort of where we start. And let me give you a sense of what the answer is. So I'm going to do this in 3 steps. One, it's probably pretty clear. I feel like I'm using terms of art that also sometimes have other meanings, and they're contested meanings. So let me tell you what I mean by democracy first. Okay? So the concept of democracy that we're interested in is very minimalistic. It's about competing for power via elections. Okay? We're asking whether an independent court system can help incentivize powerful people to continue running elections and obeying and sort of respecting their results. We're not asking about more maximal concepts of democracy. Okay? Reasonable question to think about. I can tell you why we didn't go that direction, but that's the idea. We're thinking about that kind of concept of democracy. What is then a democracy? We sort of think about it as a kind of, I don't know, I'd call it like a sort of social convention where we all sort of agree to sort of fight each other in the electoral arena. Well, that's going to come with it a series of limits on authority. So we're going to go ahead and fight for power via elections, but there are going to be some limits on the things that the powerful people can do. And that creates a problem that courts might be part of a solution to. That is, there are going to be circumstances in which powerful leaders are going to be called upon to take actions that might look like they're violating rules, right? Those leaders might say there are exigent circumstances for these actions or reasons for me to do these types of things, and we need some kind of mechanism to monitor that. That's what the court system's doing, okay? At least on our account. And so effectively what I'm going to be simplifying a whole bunch of stuff that's in the book, but the basic idea is that court systems, when populated by judges that are at least minimally detached from the sitting government, can provide a public monitoring system which, if there are consequences for violating those judges' orders, create incentives for politicians with power to be careful about how they use it, and for the opposition to respect uses of power that might seem like they push past boundaries. So it's really, as I said, the sort of mechanism of incentivizing prudence. Okay. There are some easy empirical things to do. I say easy. There are some empirical things in the book we think are relatively easy, and they're easy because we have tools of research design that allow us to at least tackle the problem reasonably. And so there's a piece of the book that's about looking at how the connection between democracy and the creation of independent courts. Okay? And there the problem is trying to get a good, estimate of the effect of competition on judicial independence. So I can talk to you about how we do that in a couple different ways. They are the harder parts. The harder parts are about what I think of the most interesting part of the book. They're about dogs that don't bark, right? They're about political leaders that don't take actions that they would have taken had there not been a set of independent judges sitting in front of them. Okay, and so we look at that in a couple different ways. We look at primarily some work that's on the investigation of former leaders. We look at work on declarations of states of emergency. We then have some work that's on coups and ultimately trying to explain democratic breakdowns. And I'll just give you 2 pieces of information, just empirical information. If you didn't read anything in the book and you're never going to read it, here are just 2 little facts, okay? One's a really nice paper by Daly and Kim, and what they find is that the probability that a sitting government will investigate a member of a previous government decreases in the independence of the court system in which that government sits, but only if there isn't an insider who's from the previous administration who's providing evidence, right? So it's precisely basically where you've got a situation where there's a lot of credible evidence that there was wrongdoing. The court systems are not prohibiting or lowering the chances that the current, say, president investigates a past president. But when there isn't this evidence, that's when the court system matters. Okay? And the last thing I'll just tell you is imagine a global sample of countries. Okay? Just imagine just all of the countries that ever had a transition to democracy. Okay? And imagine thinking about what the independence of their judiciary looked like over time as they're moving towards their transitional moment. They're an autocratic country, and they're about ready to transition. Okay? What this looks like is basically flat Okay, there's not a lot of change in judicial independence until the transition, and then there's a massive spike, right? Which is very consistent with this idea that democracy causes judicial independence. Now think about a different set of countries. Countries that all had transitions to autocracy. They broke down. And imagine the same kind of line tracking the independence of their court system. It's going to be pretty low, right? It's going to be high, more or less, in the democratic period. Okay, and it's going to drop after the transition into autocracy. But the interesting thing is that drop starts about 13 to 14 years on average prior to the breakdown. Okay? So the last thing I'll say is, what are the implications of all this? I mean, the first is that we ought not to anticipate that our courts are going to, under all circumstances, be limits on our governments. I haven't spoken much about this, but a core condition is we actually have to have competing parties that want to participate in a democracy. There's got to be a deal to be monitored. If we fail to agree on that, you shouldn't expect the courts to help you. And the last thing I'll just say is there's a lot of attention that's been placed on building and supporting courts in democratizing places over the last 30 to 40 years. And that was good work. What our book suggests is that we ought to be paying and investing in precisely the places where it looks like there isn't a problem, right? Because if the mechanism's right, it's because there are incentives that are being created for basically good politics. But the judges in those countries are doing good work, need support, need professionalization training. Basically, they need a lot of stuff that we don't usually offer them, right? We sort of let our judiciaries kind of run themselves in many advanced democracies. And we think that's a mistake. We ought to be providing, in a certain sense, some support for courts where it seems like they're doing good work.
Well, that seems like a very important point to me, because if courts are going to operate as monitoring agents, that requires transparency. The courts, you pointed out that the political actors need an incentive not to defy the court. Well, one incentive would be public support for the court. And maintaining public support for a court can be very dicey in certain countries, right? So I'd like to talk more with you about that later, but I think we'll turn to Professor Diamond so that he can offer us his thoughts about this important topic and reflect upon Jeff's comments, or obviously offer your own thoughts about this issue of whether courts can save us in a democracy. Seems very salient in light of 2020 to me at the moment. And welcome again.
Right. Well, it's nice to be with you. And I just started reading Jeffrey's book. It really looks fabulous. I'm very excited about it. It's obvious that it's a very important contribution to the literature. Let me just make a few points. The first one is, it's obvious to me that independent, liberal, and authoritarian populist leaders assault the independent. Why would they bother? And if you look at the trajectory of authoritarian decay and decline in Hungary as a paradigmatic opinion, despite the grotesque inability of Freedom House to recognize that Hungary is no longer a democracy, and it's still membership in relatively good standing in the European Union, and Poland as a severely embattled and endangered democracy. One of the differences is that Orban was able to completely get a hold of the judicial system and ruthlessly purge it. law and justice in law justice in Poland went pretty far down that road, but haven't quite fully executed that project. It is alarming the degree to which Narendra Modi in India is seeking to purge the courts and reshape them in his very important as a check on can at least be modest checks or barriers. I think the title of our program tonight is deliberately provocative. Can the court save democracy? And I think one of the implications, and the first few pages that I read is, adjust your expectations here. If you expect the courts alone to be the saviors of democracy when everything else is going in the wrong direction, it's probably not a very realistic expectation. But on the margins, when things are finally balanced and actors are having to make judgments about which way they're going to go, which norms and rules they're going to respect, the courts, I do think, can be one bulwark, and maybe an important bulwark, of democratic integrity and persistence. And, my next point would be, can the courts save democracy, ? Another answer I have is compared to what? What are the other institutions that are going to restrain power and obstruct the obstruction of justice, if I can put it that way, and the authoritarian designs of people, frankly, like Donald Trump. And again, I don't think the courts are magical, infallible, or always reliable, or even always nonpartisan institutions. But again, compared to what? And I'm not sure that democracy would have survived in 2020 in the United States without the courts. Because if you look at those, what was it, over 80 court decisions that the election results, Trump lost, I think, all but one of those decisions, and the one he didn't lose was on a relative technicality. And I think one reason why is that, we're on at least a little firmer ground. When we're in the judicial arena, you do have to have some kind of evidence for your claim. You can't just scream something on Fox News and claim it's true, even if you have no evidence for it, as Rudy Giuliani or this maniacal woman who was trying to take over Trump's defense was doing. So I think the rules of procedure and the rules of evidence that are embedded in courts also provide a potential lifeline for resolving electoral disputes. And as in the year 2000, or in the presidential election controversy there, or there was a controversial decision by the Kenyan Supreme Court some years ago in a presidential election. People may not like the decision, but at least there's some basis of evidence in it. And there's some final resolution. And I think getting, or at least we thought there would be, in terms of constitutionalism, getting a constitutionally legitimate final resolution, I think is extremely important. And this is why I think the effort that will ensue very soon after the election next week to pass in the lame duck session of the US Congress the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022 is extremely important, but not only to clarify that the vice president has a purely ceremonial role in deciding in counting the electoral votes, that there's no decision to be made by the vice president. There's also an affirmation of the role of the courts here, both the state courts and the federal courts, and a stipulation in the Electoral Count Reform Act that once the legal challenges in a state to what were the declared electoral results for president have been exhausted, and the courts have, if they need to, imposed a decision in a dispute on who is the legitimate winner of a state's electoral votes, then that seals the decision from the state going to the US Congress. And you can't have two submissions of electors, as happened fraudulently in some states in the year 2000. So, you know, we all worry that judges are human beings, and Supreme Court justices as well, that they're not free of partisan attachments and biases. I think that's been obvious over a long period of time. But I think that because they have to answer to certain rules of procedure and rules of evidence, and because many of them, you know, I think exhibited in the year 2020 pretty impressive nonpartisanship, including many Trump-appointed judges who ruled against Trump's appeals to overthrow this result or that in a state. There's more integrity in the judicial realm than we find in many other realms. And so, as I said, it's relative to what? Relative to the politicization, the frightening politicization that's being attempted now of electoral administration in the United States, relative to the, I think, alarming abandonment of democratic norms by many members of the Congress, not to mention the sewer that social media has become and so on. The judiciary still, to my mind, is a more hopeful arena. And I think in the current context of the United States and of some, you know, developing and maybe we thought more uncertain democracies, still a vital arena for the attempt to defend democracy. Maybe I can square my intervention with Jeffrey's in that way. There's one more point I'll make, which I think is really interesting, which is what happens when the judiciary runs amok as a law unto itself. There's been some really fascinating and important reporting from the New York Times and elsewhere about judicial excess in Brazil, and the judges there, you know, essentially aggrandizing their own power in ways that strike me, even as a kind of philosophical supporter of the judiciary's role here, as very dangerous. And so I don't know if our other two panelists would want to comment on that, but I think there needs to be a balance between the problem raised in this book of the judiciary kind of pragmatically shrinking away from controversy in order to kind of defend what's left of its political viability, and the judiciary kind of aggressively overreaching in the pursuit of it.
I think that final point is incredibly important too, because we live in a world in the United States in which we don't have any more constitutional amendments, and Congress is passing fewer laws to overturn Supreme Court decisions. So we really have a Supreme Court that is operating within its own bubble, I think, Larry, and that may be conceived by as some as sort of aggrandizing. It's a happenstance aggrandizement of the judiciary, who is the last interpreter of the Constitution. So, so thank you so much. And Tom, you're still with us?
I am
Tom,
indeed.
I'm going to turn the podium over to you, so to speak, the Zoom podium over to you. Larry, thank you so much for those incredibly insightful comments. Tom?
Thanks, Professor Lindquist, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak about this, very thought-provoking book. Incidentally, I'd already started reading the book before I even got the invitation, so I was already hooked. But what I want to talk about is just what all of this looks like from the view of comparative constitutional law, because that's where I sit. And as Professor Lindquist said in the introduction, my work focuses a lot on democratic regression, or democratic decay as I call it, and on the legitimacy of judicial power in different democratic contexts and in relation to different democratic challenges. And that includes, building democracy in a post-autocracy state, or protecting democracy more generally. And as she said, I'm based in Australia, but I'm actually Irish, and I focus on a range of countries worldwide, including Brazil, Poland, and India. So what I want to talk about is, our starting faith in courts, recent relevant work in comparative constitutional law, and some of the blind spots there that I think that Jeffrey's book really helps with. Third, how easy it can be to capture or block a court, sometimes in quite hidden ways. And then finally, how this has actually increasingly prompted action by judges outside the courtroom. So just on the faith in courts, when you think about constitutional theory, there are different starting points, and it's really helpful to have Jeffrey's book as a resource and a data set to test what can be the more faith-based assumptions for theory and theory making in constitutional law. So in a recent paper on judicial review and democratic decay, Jan Petrov, who's a sort of rising star in Oxford, he maps out 5 groups of theories related to theorists' strength of belief in courts' capacity to protect democracy. So he says, first, you have the strong believers who see courts as major saviors of democracy. Second, you have the weak believers who see courts just as speed bumps. Third are their sort of neo-Elian theorists, building on the work of John Hart Daly, who see courts as guardians of the political process more broadly and sort of mechanics of dysfunction. And then the fourth and fifth are the more negative ones, non-believers who see courts either as insignificant actors, incapable of really doing anything, or part of the problem. So on top of that, when you're thinking about comparative con law, of course, different courts have different review powers. You have different measures of case allocation, for example. Quite a lot of courts don't have US-style docket control in the apex court, for example, and that can change, the calculus and the dynamics. In others like India, the Chief Justice has very wide case allocation powers, and that can be a sort of avenue for influence. But just thinking about recent work in comparative con law and some blind spots, I think a lot of the recent work is very much dominated by the second and third categories I mentioned: the weak believers who see courts as just speed bumps, and also the neo-Elian theorists who see courts as, capable of policing the political process. And two here are, the US scholar Stephen Gardbaum and the Australian scholar Ros Dixon. So they essentially focus on recalibrating incorporating judicial review to better address specific deficiencies of the democratic system. So in a way, they're expanding Ely's representation reinforcing theory of judicial review, which he was focused on sort of, how specific communities get excluded from the political process and dealing with issues like the electoral process. So Ross Dixon talks about, dealing with anti-democratic monopoly power, usually executive aggrandizement where institutional and electoral strength is accumulated at one site, democratic blind spots where legislatures are overlooking relevant considerations when they're engaged in lawmaking, and also democratic burdens of inertia. So blockages in the political system that lead to sort of unjustified delays, as she puts it, in meeting democratic demands for constitutional or systemic change. And Garbaum also talks about, holding the executive to account, capture of the political process by special interests, and even dealing with outright dysfunction of one or multiple institutions in the state. But clearly here, for me, they are operating somewhere between the minimalist definition of democracy and the maximalist definition in Jeffrey's terms. And I think it's a really important point you make, because the more maximalist you get, the more of a burden you're placing on courts, which perhaps they can't meet. And that's really problematic. Also, it should focus our minds on a possible distinction between democratic maintenance and democratic protection. Maintenance might be more about preventive action to ensure that the pathologies of the democratic system are addressed on an ongoing basis, whereas protection might be viewed as addressing sharper, more immediate systemic threats. So on the latter, the Israeli scholar Yaniv Rosnai has proposed what he calls an anti-bully theory of judicial review. And he makes 2 points. He says courts should be endowed with express powers to police constitutional amendments. And also they should adopt a business as usual approach to the bullying political branches. So a sort of middle ground between overreacting to bad behavior or simply deferring when the political heat is turned up. And that can make a lot of sense in a lot of contexts. Recently you see the Slovakian Constitutional Court striking down a constitutional amendment that would have allowed security forces to vet judicial appointees, for example, which was seen as problematic in terms of judicial independence. Also in Brazil, and I'm glad you've both mentioned it, under President Bolsonaro, you have a Supreme Court that is very far from infallible or magic or perfect. It's aggrandized its own power. There's a lot of corruption, but they have provided a bulwark against specific measures under Bolsonaro, who is a much more expressly authoritarian actor, I would say, than the likes of Modi or Kaczynski in Poland or whatever. So this includes, attempts to circumvent Congress through patently unconstitutional executive lawmaking. You've measures to simply remove civil society participation in local governance, which was really key to some of the democratization of the system. You've attempts to curb indigenous rights, and those all have been stopped. And what's really helpful is in Jeffrey's book is, while we tend to talk about this in a certain language among constitutional lawyers, separation of powers, standards of review, and so on, you give us a different set of intellectual resources to think about, including the importance of a high level of political competition to whether a court can act sort of effectively or not. And here, that is absolutely a salient point in the Brazilian context, because you have a very, very sort of large multi-party system of coalitional presidentialism and everything else. And it really gives us something more to think about. But I think it's really important as well just to think about how, the nature of democratic decay is slower, it's subtler than coups, you've disparate actions that are mutually reinforcing, no full frontal assaults on institutions. Often it's not about new constitutions, not about new constitutional amendments. You can get sort of flurries of statutory law like in Poland. You can also get a range of extra legal measures like the abuse of money bills in India to sort of shove through legislation, or you can get fast tracking of legislation in Poland, tactics like reducing time for the opposition to even speak in Parliament. And courts can't really easily police a lot of those kinds of issues. And even where measures are contained in law, like in Poland, it's a fire hose of legislation that no court really could adequately review. very quickly, I just want to say, how easy it can be to capture a court. We tend to speak about the court, what can the court do? But between 2015 and 2017, you might be talking about a very different entity. So the Hungarian paradigm is, you get court packing by expanding the court size. You've changing the retirement age for judges, which gets rid of a whole load of top judges out of the system, and you've changing the top court's jurisdiction. In Poland, it's sort of, refusing to allow the 3 judges appointed by the outgoing government to even assume office. You've changing the leadership of all courts, but you're also forcing senior judges to take holiday leave. Measures like this, you've changing disciplinary structures to control judges. And even when the Constitutional Tribunal actually issued a judgment saying, look, this new law on the Constitutional Tribunal is unconstitutional, the government simply refused to publish the judgment. They pretended it didn't even exist. In India, then it's even more hidden. You have a polyvocal court that doesn't sit en banc. It's seen by some as having abdicated its constitutional role in placing fetters on the executive because it's placing so much of its political capital on social and economic rights. But the Chief Justice case allocation powers mean that you might have a lot of independent judges on that court who would adjudicate in a certain way, but they don't get the opportunity to, right? And that's quite a hidden issue. And it all has a distorting effect on how the court works, but that doesn't mean that the courts can't do anything. So in these cases where the court's simply been blocked from dealing with things through adjudication, we see judges taking really unprecedented action outside the courtroom. So in Poland, we've seen a move from simply dissents by the original judges against the PAC judges and so on, to things like boycotting appointment processes for the top courts. You've kicking the Minister for Justice, who's a former judge, out of one of the main judicial associations. You've issuing reports detailing, so this is through judicial associations, once again, detailing the unconstitutionality of specific measures. You see them joining wider civil society movements. And even really strikingly, you have this silent vigil in January 2020, where thousands of Polish judges and also judges from over 20 EU states made a silent vigil from the Supreme Court to the Parliament to protest the government's relentless assaults on judicial independence. And they were accompanied by tens of thousands of citizens. In India, you have unprecedentedly in 2018, 4 of the top Supreme Court judges, not the Chief Justice, held a press conference for the first time saying the Chief Justice is abusing his case allocation powers and there are threats to democracy. But they were quite vague about what those threats were. So that leaves us just for me with a range of questions. I'll just leave you here. How does context affect the legitimacy of courts' defensive adjudication, so action within the courtroom? And here I think it's not just about the current political context and how we view what systemic threats there might be, but also whether a democracy has previously experienced autocracy. That can give a more immediate, sharper edge to what are perceived threats. How much does even partial packing or distortion of a court's membership or operation affect its ability to act as a bulwark? Can extrajudicial protests, so acting outside the courtroom, be legitimate when other prospects for defending the constitutional democratic order are closed? How can judges do any of this in contexts where the nature of partisan contestation means adherence to even bedrock principles of the constitutional democratic order can easily be represented as partisan rather than principled? The final 2 are what might be constitutional design responses to these questions. And here I think it's important to mention, I think it was very important what Larry said, having a more broad-based approach. The courts can't do everything. And there's really interesting recent work by people like Mark Tushnet, Taran Apkatan on 4th branch institutions, for example, the importance of election commissions, the importance of integrity commissions, and so on. And then finally, what does success look like? We have the encouraging better behavior, we have influencing, we have stopping certain measures, but also I think we need to think about in really bad contexts, sometimes the courts are engaged in, they might have lost the immediate battle, the immediate war, but they're engaged in memory work that will be really important. They're stating things for the record. And that might be really important when you're talking about a transition back or at least a process of constitutional repair after a period of democratic decay. But fantastic book, really, really enjoyed it. And thanks for the invitation.
Tom, thank you so much. I mean, talk about laying out an incredible research agenda of questions that need to be answered rather urgently. Really do appreciate those thoughts from you. And we're getting close to 7, so I hope the audience will bear with me. I know you have questions. I just want to give Jeff like 2 minutes just as in any immediate thoughts that you had in response to the comments that we just heard, and then we can hear from our audience with Q&A.
Yeah, there's so much on the table. I want to, I do want to say one thing about the 2020 election, just to, almost as a way of making concrete, or just giving you an example of how you think about applying what we're arguing in that context, because it puts both things on the table. You can focus on the judicial decisions ending the litigations, right? That would be one way to think about the way that courts are saving democracy. What I would encourage us to do is focus somewhere else, right? So who were the actors who had real power to change the electoral outcomes, right? It wasn't really the President of the United States or his lawyers, right? The primary people were secretaries of state, right? Like county election officials. I'm just throw out one because I'm in Arizona, a Speaker of a House, right? So what did they do? And so I'd focus on sort of the reactions of those officials in the context of the court system that we have here, because I do think we still have a relatively independent, well-functioning judicial system. It's not to say that those decisions weren't important. I would just say think about, right, like what were the actions that weren't taken as a consequence of what we enjoy?
Excellent. I agree with that. So I know there must be questions out there. I want to make sure that we have time to. Yes, sir.
To what extent, if any, is the role of public opinion impacting the judiciary as a bulwark, or a leading indicator or following indicator on its, we hope, role in protection of democracy?
Just for Tom and Larry, the question is, how does public opinion affect the court's role in saving or as a bulwark of democracy? And I'll
have that answer.
Yeah, would either of you, if you want to respond, if you could just let me know, raise your hand. In the meantime, I'll just ask Jeff to just make a comment, and then I'd like to turn it over to you. Go ahead. It's a good question,
so the
an
way
important
that
one.
I'm sorry.
No, just that it's an important question. So.
It's a good question. There are a number of different types of public opinion we could be thinking about. So I actually was thinking about the question you asked at the beginning, which was about the support for the court itself. And that's a sort of important component of what we want to argue. So if there are no consequences for defying a court order, and here's an example. 2009 breakdown of democracy in Honduras looks like that, right? You have a judiciary, you have a Supreme Court that was starting to take actions to stop a president from holding a referendum that seemed like it was arguably unconstitutional. But the responses to the decisions and what they were doing was from people with powers to largely ignore that court. It's not a very well supported court, to say the least, right? If you don't have a court that there are no consequences for defying an order, everything that we're talking about, the incentivization of prudence, just goes completely out the window. And so I think it's extremely important that the court system is well supported. And then there's some other elements to it that, Professor Diamond raised. What are the other actors out there? So civil society organizations, all the organizations that support judicial systems are part of making, right, this mechanism work, right, through ensuring that there are consequences for ignoring a court order. Bar associations, the media. I mean, it's, our educational system.
Law schools.
Right. Right.
Let me turn to Larry and Tom. Thoughts from either of you? Larry?
Well, I think this is really a question for legal scholars. But it stands, there's a kind of old aphorism, and with two distinguished legal scholars, I hate to be resorting to aphorisms, that judges are not immune to public opinion and to the environment around them. Obviously, they can shape it, shock it, remake it or inflame it in a variety of ways. But the less formal literature that I have read suggests that the environment does have an impact, and that a substantial crystallization or populist, to put it in the context of the era we're living in, populist mobilization of anti-court sentiment can be intimidating at the least. But I'm not the expert on this.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I would say the same thing. Larry referred to the autocratic playbook, and often we think about the change of courts membership or their structure, their operation, but usually there is a very sustained delegitimization of the courts as an aspect of that comes before they actually go for those changes to soften up public opinion and to make it seem like it's necessary. In Poland, for example, it's claiming that there are still far too many communists within the judiciary and we need to root them out, even though there have been lustration processes and so on in the past. And in Brazil, it's just casting them as enemies of progress, enemies of the state, enemies of the president, enemies of the people. And, I think these are very sustained sort of delegitimization strategies that can be really central.
I just one more point. I think, Jeffrey, is a great question. But just the other day, I was walking through a friend's living room, and I won't mention the actual news network that was on the television, but the byline or whatever on the bottom was, "Our justice system is a joke." And I got a little steamy over that, because that was in prime time, telling the average viewer that the system that sustains the rule of law is a joke. And it's not. I mean, we have one of the most brilliant legal systems. Yes, we have issues, but it's certainly, relatively speaking, incredible. And so I think that's part of the erosion of people's confidence in the courts can take place in lots of different contexts. More questions? Yeah.
Does the popular election of judges inhibit or enhance their ability to be these bulwarks of democracy themselves?
That's a good question.
I think it.
Go ahead and answer.
Well, I've studied this a little bit. I mean, elected courts have their own separate independent base of support, and the studies that I've done show that they actually elected judges are more willing to counter legislation, so exercise the power of judicial review. They're also more willing to destabilize precedent, overturn their precedents, because they're elected and they're responding to their constituencies. But to me, it seems like it's a very valuable question, because if they have their own independent electoral base of support, then they, I think, it may be more willing institutionally to be bulwarks against, and that's indeed why judges were elected in the first place, because legislatures were running amok, state legislatures were running amok. So anyway, that's my response. What do you think about that?
I really think about it through the connection between the elections and the kind of people that you end up sitting on these courts. And I think the beauty of the U.S. Supreme Court actually over time is really a horrible system for selecting a Supreme Court judge. It's just kind of lucky based on the competitiveness of the national electoral system. So that's sort of like an accident that you ended up with a rough balance of judges across the courts. And to me, it would depend. I mean, I sort of imagine a one-party state. I don't mean this could be a one-party state in the sense of global, formal definition state, or a U.S. state that's a one-party state. I don't think it's not clear to me why it would matter, at least whether they were being elected and they were all basically coming from the same coalition, or they were being appointed by the same coalition. I would be worried about that kind of court.
Yeah. Let's get another question or two from yes, ma'am.
My question was related to the person who asked about the appointment of judges and the value of comparing, the value, digamos, of comparing countries where you had a history of autocratic governance, where whether appointed or selected by the upper house or whatever, it didn't matter really, because they were influenced by the executive or by the dictator or whatever it might be, with countries where there has been a long tradition of a more functioning democracy. And that's why I've been very surprised at the appearance of Brazil as a good comparative study, you know what I mean? But comment on that. That's
Just for the, I'm sorry I didn't repeat the last question to the two of you on Zoom. I'm so sorry. This question is related though, and it is about the history of, I guess it's about what are the proper comparators and in terms of countries and comparing countries, and whether or not a history of autocracy affects the likelihood, and I think you've commented on this, Jeff, the likelihood that the judiciary will operate as a bulwark. Is that your question?
exactly.
Okay.
Or that there would be any independence, or that they would care about public opinion.
And that the other piece, tell me if I got this right, the other piece is that the precise institutional design for selecting judges might not be as important as the history of democracy in the country.
If the history of democracy is lacking,
Right.
and the people who are going to have these opinions don't value democratic institutions or organizations or all the things of the accoutrements of civil society, they don't value that, then does it make any difference?
And the last bit was about public opinion again, sort of how much do the citizens value, have democratic values internalized, et cetera. So I'm going to, why don't we go, Tom, do you want to respond to this? It seems to me, and I think the question of institutional design is extremely important. Does it really matter how long the term lengths are, what the appointment process is, et cetera? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because you see judicial appointment coming up again and again and again as an issue here. So in Brazil, for example, you have a somewhat similar process to the US as I understand it, but it's operating in a very different political context because you don't have a bipartisan system and you don't have the hyper-partisan sort of ship that's happening in the US in the same way. What you have is a multi-party, it's about 30 parties in the system, and the president has to already form a coalition to get anything done, which leads to a certain extent to a greater sort of focus on consensus building for judicial appointments, for example, as well as getting other things done like laws. So I think that's really important. The flip side is India, where the judges through the collegium system have completely accorded all power to themselves over judicial appointments, and that's seen as producing all of these very sort of perverse effects, like just protecting them from any forms of democratic accountability, which would be completely necessary. So that's a major issue, and I think it's a really important question. I think when you're in a post-authoritarian situation, often there's very well articulated demands for how judicial appointments should work, and that can help because the democratic forces have a very clear vision of how they want the courts to work and they want the judges to work.
Larry, would you like to share any thoughts on that question?
Well, I want to go back to the previous question first. There are few institutional procedures in democracy that I find more troubling and counterproductive and wrong-headed than electing judges. I think no judge in any democracy should ever at any level stand for election. And I think it is a perverse and extremely damaging compromise of the function of the judiciary and the principle of judicial independence to turn judges into politicians who, by the way, then also have to raise money for their reelection. How can judges possibly rule dispassionately and independently when they have to worry about the sentiments of the electorate and the need to raise money for an electoral campaign? I just find it jaw-dropping in its contradiction of what should be the independent role of the judiciary in a democracy. And I think the answer to this dilemma is to have reasonable term limits. Well, obviously, Supreme Court justices don't run for re-election in the United States, although in a way they campaign for appointment, which is another perversity. But we are the only constitutional democracy, I believe, is a very daring thing to say in the presence of my two colleagues who would have a definitive answer to this that I don't. But I think we are the only significant democracy that has neither a term limit nor an age limit for our constitutional court judges. And that's a huge mistake. I strongly favor the proposed reform that would create 18-year term limits for Supreme Court judges and give each president in his or her first and third years an opportunity to appoint a new Supreme Court justice. Unfortunately, we'd have to grandmother in the existing justices into life terms, but I think this would at least go a little bit of the way to, on the one hand, depoliticize the court because the stakes would be less. On the other hand, produce a little more electoral accountability in the sense that a newly elected president would have an opportunity for sure to appoint two court justices to the court. And then it's not a 40-year proposition. They serve 18 years and then they rotate back to the federal judiciary.
That's great. There is always the question, independence from whom, right? Who are we making our judges independent from? The electorate or the legislature or what have you. So, well, we, according to my watch, we could probably take one more question. What do you think, Claire? Would that work? Okay.
I want to ask you about the International Court of La Hague. Can you explain why America, the United States, is not part of it?
International Court of what?
La Hague? La Hague.
Oh, The Hague. That, I don't have the answer to that. Tom or Larry? Tom may. Do you know the answer to that? Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, why are we not part of the Hague, the International Court at The Hague? I'm not an expert in international law, so I don't.
But we talk about democracy here, no? The court, democracy. That's part of democracy, La Hague, no? I mean, the court system there, they are going to judge all the criminal law.
You're talking about the criminal court.
International
Okay.
criminal law.
Yeah.
Is that,
Yeah, there's a good reason for that. Sorry,
yeah, and I think that America is not part of it. I mean,
We're
the
not.
United States. And
She's asking about the criminal court, International Criminal Court.
why cannot that change? I mean, why cannot that be?
I mean, sorry, I'll answer real quickly. There's a general political, sort of realpolitik answer to that, which is, well, you're is the unipolar world where they're a police officer for the world. There are a whole series of things that officers of the U.S. government do that are arguably violations of international law, and I think it's an effort to shield those officials from prosecution, generally. International prosecution, not domestic prosecution.
Thanks for the question. Either you want to comment on that, and then we'll wrap this up, I believe. Tom?
I just think there's a general rise across a lot of constitutional democracies of a type of party and a type of government that wishes to be freed from constraint in general. And you see it, revealing itself in a lot of antagonism towards not just domestic courts, but international courts. So Hungary and Poland, you see a lot of antagonism with the Court of Justice of the EU. You see in the UK, the government is very keen in some ways to depart from the European Court of Human Rights. And it is just this view that we should be generally freer from constraint, which of course for anyone who's committed to the rule of law and having adequate protection for minority rights and for core democratic rights and so on, that would be an enormous problem. But it's a huge trend.
Well, I want to thank the audience for your patience with us because we have gone over, I think, the traditional 1 hour limit for the PCFR. Sorry. First, I think it's important for us to thank Carol McNamara, too, who is at the Center for Constitutional Design. Carol, thank you. Jay Jenkins and ISIS. She did not tell me to thank her, by the way. She told me she had another reason. she's asking me to reminding me that we have a website, constitutionaldesign.asu.edu. Please join our conversations. We're launching a Substack and some podcasts and things like that, and we'd love you to be part of that conversation. I think today, in fact, we've touched on many questions of constitutional design, particularly focused on the judiciary, but on other institutions as well. And so I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to Claire and for our partnership with the PCFR. Thank you to Jeff, Tom, and Larry for what has been, to me, and I think the audience would agree, an incredibly enlightening discussion and lots to think about going forward to the 2022 elections and the 2024 elections in the United States. So thanks to everyone. Oh, thanks to PBS also. Thank you to PBS.